Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kevin Gray and I'm a reference librarian here at Reed Memorial Library. I have a background in history and I'm also a specialist in genealogy and local history research. I'm also the Vice President of the Portage County Historical Society. Today we're going to be talking about the history of the Ravenna glass industry and why it's important. And it's a little bit of a different format for us. We're used to doing something in a room filled with people, so we're obviously not able to do that right now. If you guys want to ask questions, feel free to do that in the chat box on Facebook, and we'll try to get those questions answered the best we can. Two things I want to talk about today, or two questions you might want to keep in mind, are why is the glass industry in Ravenna important? What was the significance to us, to our town? And second question is, where were those factories located? I know that's a question a lot of people have in town because there's actually nothing remaining in town as far as a physical building you can go up to and see, this is where it used to be located. So I've heard some misinformation about, where those factories were, and so hopefully this will clear some of those questions up. Obviously I can't answer every question because there's a lot we still don't know about the glass industry, and there's a lot of stuff that was never recorded to begin with, so that, it's an ongoing research project and there's still a lot of stuff we can learn. So let's start off with the next slide here. This is an interesting photo. This is a picture snapped in sometime in the 1970s. I don't have the date of the picture, but it's basically on either side of Ravenna, and it's one of those signs you see when you enter town. It's saying, welcome to Ravenna, settled in 1799 by Benjamin Tappan. And it's also saying Ravenna was an early glassmaking center. And this is really interesting because, you have a sign saying one thing about Ravenna. This is the one thing they wanted everybody to know about Ravenna. You could think about it today. Is this the same thing that we would want to advertise our town as the center of an early glassmaking center? There's so many other industries that went on in Ravenna. Is this still the most important thing that's ever happened here? Well, back when this sign was made, they thought it was. And so hopefully this presentation will help explain why that was such an important thing for people to know about and why it played such a role in Ravenna's past. Okay, so basically there were 3 different glass factories in Ravenna. I didn't say 3 different companies. There were lots of different companies that ran those factories. So, as soon as one company would fold, somebody else would take over. But basically there were 3 different factories in town. The first one was the Ravenna Glass Company, started in 1857, and the last one closed around 1893. That was the Eagle Glass. So you could say it was roughly about 30 years that glass making was a very important industry in Ravenna's past. And so what I'm going to do during this presentation, I'm going to look at these 3 different locations. On this slide I'm just calling them A, B, and C. And so we're going to look through and see how each of those factories changed over the years. They were run by different companies and what their ultimate fate was. So this slide here, it's showing Erie Railroad. This is late 19th century. And you can't really see it on the screen, I'm sure, but the track going through Ohio does actually run right through Ravenna. There were 3 railroads running through Ravenna. Ravenna got its first railroad in 1851, which was the Cleveland and Pittsburgh. Cleveland and Pittsburgh became actually it stayed the Cleveland and Pittsburgh. The second railroad that came through town was the Atlantic and Great Western, became the Erie Railroad. Third railroad was the Baltimore and Ohio. That was on the south side of town. That came through in 1884. So railroads were really what kicked off industry in Ravenna. Before that, it was really hard to transport your goods. And really the only industries in Ravenna for about the first 50 years of its existence, starting in 1799, were mills for grinding flour and other things that went along with agriculture. So agriculture was the primary mode of living before these other industries took over with the industrialization and the railroads. So going along with the other slide showing the 3 different locations. This is a 1884 Sanborn map. This is in the northwest corner of Ravenna, and this is showing where 2 of those railroads actually joined up, the Atlantic and Great Western and the Cleveland and Pittsburgh. So it's the Atlantic and Great Western going along the top. It's the one that became the Erie. And Cleveland and Pittsburgh kind of goes north and south. And you'll see first factory on the left there, it's on the northwest side of Diamond Street. It's actually called the Diamond Glass Company. So that's the first building we're going to be looking at. To the right of that, on the west side, on the east side, Enterprise Glass Company, that's the second location. And then the third location, it's kind of hard to see, but it's actually down on Bowery Street. Bowery became Highland Avenue, and it's actually on the south side, right near the railroad tracks. You'll see it right on the south side of Bowery Street there. It says Flint Glass. So that was the third location we're going to be looking at today. So this is the story that everybody hears when we're talking about how the glass industry started. This is a quote from the early industrial development of Ravenna. I'm not sure the author, but I do have this posted on the library's website, so you can go back and read the whole article. And the author says, "There's a story about a pane of glass and a man."
I think we lost the stream.
Okay, there's a technical difficulty there. So starting off again, this is the article from early industrial development of Ravenna. Starting off, there is a story about a pane of glass and a man. Authorities differ as to who that man was. A.B. Griffin, author of Ravenna 40 years ago, claims to be that man. Others say it was Seth Day. Possibly they were in on it together. Anyway, 2 men had driven to Cleveland by wagon, and the one had carefully carried home a large pane of glass in his hands, so that it would not be broken by the jarring of the wagon over the rough roads. One can imagine the strain it must have been to hold it during that long, tedious trip. Upon arrival, as he was looking for a safe place to set it down, he dropped it, and it broke into 1,000 pieces. He decided that Ravenna needed a glass factory. At about that same time, it happened that the postmaster in Ravenna received a letter from a glassblower in Pittsburgh, inquiring if Ravenna might be a suitable place for a glass company. The letter was turned over to the Board of Trade, and on this board was Mr. Day, or Mr. Griffin. The Pittsburgh man was given assurance that the location was good and there was sufficient interest. He was invited to come to Ravenna at the personal expense of our friend. One thing I would like to point out about this is Pittsburgh already had an enormous glass industry at that time. It went back to 1797. By the early 20th century, Pittsburgh was making 80% of all the glass in the United States. And so basically there was a glassblower in Pittsburgh that wanted to start up a competitor, somebody to compete with Pittsburgh. And it's quite a task considering they're starting up about 50 years after Pittsburgh began their glass industry. So they were kind of on an uphill climb to see if it was possible. So the man who could be considered the father of the glass industry was Seth Day. He's the one who really answered that letter and said, yes, we do have a place where the glass industry could take off. And this quote from the 1885 History of Portage County book, it gives a little bit of his background. He was born in 1809, became a county commissioner. He was appointed the clerk of the Common Pleas Court. In 1817, he became recorder, and 1818, postmaster of Ravenna. He had his offices until 1832 when he entered private business, where he became widely known. Also, it doesn't say in this article, but he was also in the War of 1812, and he's buried up at Maple Grove Cemetery. So he had a very interesting life before going into business, but Seth Day considered this something worthwhile and probably profitable, so he said, yes, let's go ahead and go with it. We'll see what we can do. This article from February of 1857, it's basically just giving an introduction to what they're going to do. talking about the project. They're going to be building and establishing a glass factory in Ravenna. And it lists Seth Day, E. Spalding, and S. Terry, who are business partners. The second part of the article, it's saying the establishment will be located on the land of Mr. Day, west of the village. Buildings are to be constructed immediately. By the month of September next, it is proposed to have the establishment in full operation. And so Seth Day was really able to do this because he had the land and he also had the supplies. This slide here, it's the map of 1857. I don't know if you can see it at home, but it does show Seth Day's property on the west side. It's listed Day and Spalding. It's on the west side of town, for Ravenna here. And you can also see the railroad tracks coming down there, Cleveland and Pittsburgh, that they're actually going to establish their factory close to, so it's going to be easy to ship their product. The second map, it just zoomed out a little bit from the same map. And on the south side, you can actually see Sandy Lake. And Seth Day owned Sandy Lake and the land around it, so that was actually where they got their sand from to supply the glass industry. You know, sand is one of the major things you need to make glass. So because of all the glacial deposits in this part of Ohio, there was a large amount of sand located nearby, and they were able to easily transport that up to town to their factory. This picture here shows the building. It's called the Stone Store. This was the Ravenna Glass Company's shop where they would actually sell their product. This photograph was from 1857, so it's the same year that the company opened up, and you can actually see right on the front of the building, it's hard to read, but it does say on there Ravenna Glass Company right on the front of the building. Now that building is actually older. It was built in the 1830s as a general store, and up until that time they sold just a wide variety of products that you would need in a small village. So pretty much anything you would need, you just go there to purchase. But Seth Day figured, you know, since I already own the store, I can also sell the glass products there as well. And that's when he renamed it the Ravenna Glass Company store. Here's a couple more pictures of that same building. It's still on the south side of Main Street. You can see picture on the left, they actually added a third floor to the building, and that's from 1875. And then on the picture on the right, you can see they added a fourth floor. So what started out as a two-story building actually is 4 stories tall today, and they did a pretty good job matching up the stonework, so it does look like it's all original. The picture on the right is actually after Mr. Riddle took over the building, and that's when he kind of purchased it and decided to have the top roof line up with his Riddle block number 1. So this next article, this is a newspaper clipping from 1857, and they're just talking about the goods that they're selling at their store. Dry goods, groceries, hardware, crockery, boots and shoes, hats and caps, carpets, pretty much everything you need. It's kind of like the 19th century Walmart, I guess. And this is another article from 1857, and this is talking after they finished opening. And it's saying one of the most interesting as well as instructive places to visit about Ravenna is the Glass Works, located a little west of the village. This establishment is now in full operation. The building is an excellent structure for the purpose, and its situation is admirable. The establishment will add to the wealth and business of our town and community. It will add every other kind of business carried on by our citizens. And they're saying, we hope this is only the beginning of manufacturers in Ravenna. So this is the first, and they're hoping, you know, once it takes off, more people will start building businesses here, and it'll become more of a manufacturing center than it was. This next article from the same newspaper from October 29th, 1857. It's talking more about the glass that they're selling at the store. And toward the bottom it will say they're in full operation, making all kinds of druggistware, wine and cider bottles, fruit and preserve jars, glass milk pans, etc. We are now prepared to fill any orders for glassware on short notice. So they're in business and they're up and running and they're just looking for things to manufacture. Next summer, this is the next article we could find. This is June 24th, 1858. They say, "We are pleased to learn that the Ravenna Glass Company will resume operations at the factory sometime next month. It is somewhat early to commence, but the filling of large orders and the increased business of the company render it necessary." So they're obviously in good shape at that point in time. The next slide, this is kind of the cutting edge technology. This is what they were really promoting at the time as far as a way to preserve food in a sanitary manner. This is what they call an airtight fruit can. And they're saying it's what everybody wants. So the farmers who are canning at home, you're still canning your own products to store in the root cellar or keep it for next year. You need something where it's going to last, and so they wanted to come up with something that's sanitary and easy to clean. And this was basically something that everybody did want at the time. They were still perfecting different ways to improve fruit jars, and this was ultimately the ancestor of the mason jar that we know today. In this picture, it shows a very rare pint-sized fruit jar made in Ravenna, embossed airtight fruit jar on one side, and Ravenna Glass Works, Ohio on the other. And this is in the collection of the Portage County Historical Society. The next slide here, this is talking about basically some of the conduct of the glass workers. They were known to be a rowdy bunch of individuals, and basically there was an employee who had a dispute with his boss, and it says, "He turned around, Thomas drew a bludgeon and struck him across the back of the head, knocking him down instantly. Thomas struck him twice after he fell and would no doubt have killed him had not the blowers interfered and prevented. Thomas fled immediately. Mr. Terry remained in a very precarious condition for many hours, but has so far recovered from the effects of the injuries to be about again. The manner in which the assault was made give ample evidence of the malicious and murderous designs." So this is just an example of glassblowers having a dispute, and it was a sensational story to print in the newspaper, so they're just looking for something interesting for a story. But I have read other stories that attested to the nature of glassblowers being kind of a rowdy bunch. I even read another article where one of them stole someone's pet ferret and sold it for $8. So they're getting into all kinds of trouble. And so who were the glassblowers? This next slide here has a list from the 1860 census. It gives the names and ages of the employees at that time. So these were all working for the Ravenna Glass Company, because in 1860 that was still the only glass company in town. And it's really interesting when you look and see where they came from. It looks like about a third of them are from Germany. So they were getting in a lot of employees from overseas even, who were just coming here to work in the glass industry. There's only a handful who are actually born in Ohio. Most people are from Pennsylvania, from Pittsburgh, and they're just moving west to try to get a different job. So this was bringing in business, and is also bringing in more people to our town. The next slide here shows some of the calabash bottles that were made at the Ravenna Glass Company. These were made around 1860. And this pattern was known as the Jenny Lind bottle. This was a Swedish opera singer. Jenny Lind was actually a big celebrity back then, so this would have been something that people were familiar with, and they wanted to carry it around because it was just a popular singer back then. And Jenny Lind was very popular and did a concert tour all over the United States. I'd also like to point out that we do have a Jenny Lind bottle upstairs at the second floor of our library here, so when you do stop in, you can actually see one of these in person. next bottle, this is also a calabash. This is called a sheaf of wheat design. Once again, wheat was, a really popular crop for the farmers, so this was something else they're just advertising. And these are two different bottles. You can see they're pretty much identical, except the one has a handle on the side. And this just goes to the skill of the glass blowers. And so, somebody decided they wanted to put a handle on this one, and so the glass blower said, okay, I can do that. And it's just all free blown at that point and just attached on the side. So it would have been an extra step and extra work, but that was something they wanted to add on to that one. Another thing I'll mention is just the color of the bottles. Most of them are just an aqua color. A lot of times you think of glass as just being clear. Like today, plain glass is clear. Back then, plain glass was aqua, because you actually had to add chemicals to the glass to make it clear. So they would add manganese later on to aqua glass to make it clear, but back in the day, manganese was expensive, and so most of the bottles were aqua. And that's one of the ways you can tell the really old bottles from back then. Generally aqua, unless they wanted to add another color to it, and then they could make them blue or green or amber. In this next slide, you can see 3 other colors of different variations of those colors. The one on the right, it looks yellow, but it's more of a yellow amber color. And these are all at the Portage County Historical Society. Here's just another flask. This is called a Traveler's Companion, and it has Ravenna Glass Company printed on the side. So one of the issues with identifying these bottles as products of the Ravenna Glass Company is just knowing who made it or who else could have made it. Obviously, if it says Ravenna on it, it was made here, but there's lots of other bottles that may or may not have been made here, and it's just really hard to tell because there's not enough documentation. One other thing about these 2 bottles, you can see the one on the right, the top of the bottle is just a sheared lip. The top of the bottle is basically where they took it out of the mold and just cut it off. So that's the simplest way to make a bottle. The one on the left has an extra step where it's got a applied band of glass put around the top, so it's a little bit stronger, but it's also more work. But those are generally the newer ones that have that extra step put onto them. This next bottle here, this is actually my favorite one. It's called the Pikes Peak Flask. On the one side, it has a prospector with a gun, and it says for Pikes Peak, and the other side shows him shooting a deer. So this one actually has a story that goes along with it. This refers to the 1859 gold rush. It was the Colorado Gold Rush, also known as the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. And it's basically prospectors who found gold in Colorado, in the Colorado Territory, and they moved west to try to stake a claim. And the article on the top here is actually from the Portage Sentinel, and it talks about 2 people from Ravenna who actually went out to do that. H.E. Coffin and Captain Long. So they're 2 Ravenna citizens, and they actually decided to move out west to look for gold. And it says that they weren't very lucky. It says they returned home on the Saturday last, looking hale and hearty. They had not gone quite as far on their journey as Fort Kearny, when the reports of the returning emigrants were of such a discouraging character that they thought it better to retrace their steps. So they see a lot of other people heading back east, and they decided it's not even worth going out there. This next picture, it's just a hand-blown picture said to have been made in Ravenna. And this is another example of something where, unless there's that documentation to go along with it, it would be really hard to say where it was made. But there was evidence that it was made here in Ravenna, and it's now in the Portage County Historical Society's collection. Same with this next picture. This is just a large aqua-colored glass bowl, pretty plain. But it's the kind of utilitarian stuff that would have been really valuable back then. It could have been a mixing bowl or something that would have served a really practical purpose. Okay, the next bit of news on the Ravenna Glass Company comes in 1863, when Seth Day is said to have left the factory, and it says that it bankrupted him, so he wasn't having monetary success. But we know there was other stuff going on in 1863. It's the time of the Civil War, so there was a lot else going on in our country, and the factory changed hands a number of times. And this was also a time when the factory shut down and it was not running at all for a long period of time. Later in 1863, the newspaper prints another article, and they say, Mr. Terry, the new owner of the company, is making arrangements to put the glass company back in operation. Going to be manufacturing all kinds of druggists' ware, wine bottles, and bottles of every kind. The last line says, we will fully maintain the high reputation of Ravenna's glassware in the market. Success to the Ravenna Glassworks. So they're just trying to keep the factory going. And then the next year, May of 1864, there's a very long, lengthy article printed in the newspaper. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it does give an update on the factory, and they're doing really great business. They're saying in 1863, $30,000 have been expended in payments to workmen for materials. So they're making a lot of money. And they're saying a recent census of those solely supported by the glass company gives in round numbers 200 persons. So it's all the glass blowers and their families. So that's a huge percentage of Ravenna's population. They're also talking about the business they're doing, and they're saying the entire bottle trade of Cleveland are filling orders, also in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati. So pretty much everything west of Ravenna, they're shipping glass to, even in Pittsburgh where they're have major competition. This next photo, it's showing the stone quarry. This is actually where City Park is today, so it gives you a sense of the location. This picture is facing north towards the Hotchkiss house, which is long gone. But basically, they decided to, instead of get the sand from Sandy Lake, they were going to start using the sand from the sandstone from that quarry. So it was a lot closer to the factory, and it was also a very high quality glass that you could make with that product. And so in addition to quarrying out sandstone blocks for construction, the other sand that they were coming out of there was being used for the glass factory. And at that time it was known as rock glass. So if you ever see something saying rock glass, that means it was made from the sand from sandstone. This is a couple years later. This is December 12th, 1866. By this point in time, they're no longer making a profit, pretty much. They're talking about closing down. And the part I have in bold here, it's saying the fact that these works have not succeeded heretofore may be attributed to a lack of adequate capital, for the business itself is a good and paying one. There is none better. So basically the factory they have up and running is doing a really good job producing products, but it's not making a profit anymore. So they're looking for somebody to come in and purchase it at that point. So 1866 ends up being the end of the Ravenna Glass Company. So who is it that comes in and takes over? This is a new business that takes over. This is now the Diamond Glass Company. They're using the same factory. They add on to it a little bit. This is an image of how the factory looked in 1884. You can see all the smoke coming out of the smokestacks and the roofs there. So what happens after Ravenna Glass Company closes in 1866? There's this gentleman who takes over. This is DeWitt Clinton Coolman. He was born in 1828, and he was a civil engineer on the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad and also the Atlantic and Great Western. And then he decided to become a proprietor in the Ravenna Glass Company, taking it over and naming it the Diamond Glass Company. So they were incorporated with a stock of $25,000. And this article from 1889, so this is about 20 years later, it talks about the success of how well their glass company went. So basically by 1889, D.C. Coolman is the only owner, and they have a large factory they've added onto it. They have a floor space of about 2,400 square feet, and they employ about 60 people. It also talks about the biggest difference between the two factories. It's saying that they're now just making window glass. So they're not making bottles anymore, they're just making everyday, ordinary window glass. But they're making a big profit. They're saying the capital invested is about $50,000, but the output of these works to date will reach about $1,500,000. So back in the 19th century, you can imagine how much money that is today with inflation. This next picture is from the 1884 Sanborn map, and this is showing the Diamond Glass Company, and it's showing what a array of buildings it was, and it's color coded so you can see what they're constructed from. So the yellow buildings are actually wood. If you see something that's like a pink color, those are made out of brick, and the blue is actually stonework. So there's a lot of fire and a lot of high temperatures. They don't want those buildings burning down, so they want to make them out of a structure that's fireproof, and that's where the bricks and the stonework come in. It also shows you the location here. This is on the west side of Diamond Street, and you can see the location. It's kind of between 3rd and 2nd Street on the left there, so it's a good map to give you an idea of the location today. This is a photograph from inside the Diamond Glass Company, and you can see the workers there. They're standing on elevated platforms near the glass furnace. So basically what would happen, they'd take the molten glass out of the furnace, and then they would spin it around to form the sheets of glass, and having it elevated up off the floor allowed the glass to be spun around below where you're standing. So it's kind of like a practical way to do that. So what happened to Diamond Glass Company? They went out of business because DeWitt Clinton Coolman decided it was time to retire, and he sold his business to the United Glass Company. United Glass Company was a trust based in Syracuse, New York. It was made up of about 20 glass factories in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. And shortly after that, the United Glass Company folded, so they didn't stay in business a whole lot longer after that. They were actually out of business later in 1891. Now that location was a good location for a business, so later other businesses have located there. In 1906 it became the site of the Browning Foundry. They made cast iron works. And so this is from 1921, this is right after World War II. This is the Browning Factory's building. And like I said, they made a lot of materials out of iron. It was a large supplier during World War I for military products. But they actually went out of business later on too. They didn't survive after the 1920s. And then this is the current location today. This is the parking lot just south of the St. Gobain Aerospace factory. So there is a factory there today, in that same location pretty much. It's still being used by a lot of people for very good business. So that's the end of that first location. Now the second location I'm talking about is across the street on the other side of Diamond Street. And this is a factory started by a Charles Bollinger. He was a glassmaker and an inventor. He worked in Pittsburgh, but he was really interested in producing one particular product. It was what he called an improvement in water buckets. So up until that point, most water buckets were made out of wood, and wood isn't very sanitary, so you want something that's going to be a little better than that. If you made a bucket completely out of glass, that wouldn't be good either, because that's too fragile, it would break. And so his invention was a glass lining to put inside of a wooden bucket. So that product would in theory solve both of the problems. And he was granted a patent in 1872 for that product. 1873, he secures a site for that factory, And it wasn't really seen as competition by DC Coolman because it's making a completely different product out of glass. DC Coolman's making window glass, and this guy's making a glass bucket. So they're both making things out of glass, but it's not really seen as competition. And here's a quote from the March 1874 newspaper. He's saying, "The new glass-lined water and milk pails manufactured by the Ravenna Crystal Glass Works are in the market and are not only elegant but useful." So the problem that he ran into was actually lawsuits with other business partners. And so even though it was a very useful product, it wasn't manufactured for that long of a time period, and that factory actually went out of business a few years later, 1878. Now there is one example remaining of that liner for the glass water bucket. This is at the Historical Society, and originally it would have had a wooden exterior and some sort of a padding in between to kind of pad to keep it from rattling around. Unfortunately, that wooden part has rotted away, and this is all that's left. But it shows you the glass interior, which could be removed and cleaned and sanitized, and it was really a useful product for back then. This is showing where that factory is. This is on the east side of Diamond Street, so this is the one that made the glass buckets, but then it became the Enterprise Glass Company in 1878. This is an illustration from the 1882 panoramic map of Ravenna. So you can see this is just across the street from the other factory, and it gives you a little detail of the smokestacks and also the railroad siding where the railroad tracks would be able to easily ship the materials and product. This is the Sanborn map. As you can see, it's a lot cheaper construction than the other building. It's primarily made out of wood, which is something that wasn't that great of an idea for a glass factory. Basically, the only products made out of bricks are the kiln and the different surrounding things, but the walls are entirely wood. Also says no lights in office, so it's pretty much a bare bones factory. But this was a business partnership that purchased the former Crystal Glass Factory, and they originally made lamp chimneys, and it's unclear what else they manufactured other than lamp chimneys, but lamp chimneys were a really profitable market back then. It's kind of like light bulbs today, because light bulbs burn out after a while and they need replaced, but back then the lamp chimneys they're talking about were for oil lamps, and they would frequently break because you'd take them off to light the lamp, put them back on. A lot of times you drop them and they crack, or you'd wash them off and you drop them in the sink or something. So they were always needing replaced. Now the interesting thing that happened was another dispute among these business partners that started up the factory. Basically, a lot of them decided to leave and start a third business. At that point, this factory remained idle while their competitor was in business. Crown Flint was the third business. Once Crown Flint closed in 1887, this factory opened back up again. Crown Flint were both making lamp chimneys primarily. Another thing that happened with the Enterprise was a fire. You figure it's a wooden building and that's eventually bound to happen. Now this was covered by insurance, so luckily it's about $13,000 insurance, and that paid for rebuilding it. Eagle Glass Company took over in 1882, and they operated from 1883 to 1887. They kept making lamp chimneys, but had limited success due to fierce competition. Once again, the Pittsburgh market is making about 80% of all the glass in the United States by then. And so by 1893, they're reporting not being in operation anymore. 1896 talks about the building being torn down And so this date can be kind of seen as the end of Ravenna's glass industry. So this is the middle factory torn down in 1896, and they're talking about still about how there was no real better location in the country for the manufacture of glass than Ravenna, but it was just unfortunate that the competition was not favorable for them. This is the location today of that middle factory. This is on the east side of Diamond Street. It's kind of near where the Diamond Transmission building is today. It's just a little bit north of that. Okay, so this is the third location we'll look at. This is where those business partners decided to set up a competing company to compete with the other company making lamp chimneys. And they were known as Ravenna Flint Glass. Flint glass is just another name for like a really strong glass that had lead in it, so it's a little bit stronger. And so this is actually on the south side of Bowery Street, which became known as Highland Street. And they put together, out of all the glass companies in Ravenna, they put together the largest factory building, and they employ the largest number of people. So this was really important to Ravenna's economy. Here's a picture of that factory building on the south side of Highland Street. You can see the name on the front there. It's got Crown Flint Glass. And you can see the town of Ravenna kind of in the background there. Now that street that's going kind of left to right in front there, that's actually what was called Pittsburgh Street. Pittsburgh Street was actually closed down to the public. I'll show you in this next picture here. So Pittsburgh Street is actually on the right side of this picture. You can think of it coming out on to Main Street, kind of where McDonald's is, or Bear's Motorcycle Shop. It's kind of between those two buildings. And originally it went all the way north to Highland. And Crown Flint had a really good location near the Cleveland and Pittsburgh railroad tracks. And so you can see the huge factory they put together here. And also south of the Crown Flint Glass Company was another factory. It's called Haley Brothers Foundry and Machine Shop. And so Haley Brothers actually made a lot of the glass molds that they would actually be using, the equipment that they would be using to blow the glass in. This is from Ravenna City Ordinances, and this is just talking about an ordinance for the vacation of Pittsburgh Street. Vacation means they're not going on vacation, they're just closing down Pittsburgh Street. And so basically, Crown Flint Glass Company didn't want all those people in front of their factory. It was just getting in the way, and it was just not really good for their business. So they convinced the town council to close that road down. And that road is still closed today. It's never been opened back up. So that's kind of one of the legacies of Crown Flint Glass. That's why the road doesn't go on to Main Street anymore. It's just seen as being too disruptive and too dangerous to have people walking back and forth there. This next slide is from 1889 Portage County Directory. This is Jonathan Haley. He's the mold maker. He's the one who was making those glassmakers' machines. And so he had a really successful business doing that. He patented a lot of different inventions while he was here in Ravenna. And he also stayed in town. He actually moved to Ravenna, or to Akron, after the glass industries left. And so he did stay relatively local. This is an image of one of Haley's patented molds for making glass. This is from 1885. And it's saying, mold for pressed glassware, Jonathan Haley of Ravenna, assigner to the Eureka Patent Glass Mold Company of same place. And so it's talking about the technical details of what makes this better than what came before it. I'm not going to go into the technical part of it. This quote here is from the 1885 History of Portage County. And it's talking about just the organization of the Crown Flint Glass Company. And it's saying how many people were employed, 175. So that is huge for this small of a town. Annual sales were $175,000, and the payroll was about $7,000 a month. So this was pumping a huge amount of money into Ravenna's economy at that point. like I was saying, it was the largest glass company here in town. This is just another article from that same 1889 business directory. Now here they're saying it's an average force of 165 employees. It says the works are conveniently located on the railroads, giving the greatest advantages for receiving material and shipping their products. It is distributing their goods to the trade. They have the benefit of shipping, and they're able to reach all parts of the country at low rates of freight. The producing capacity of the works will average from 125,000 to 140,000 chimneys per week. So that's per week. They're making 140,000 lamp chimneys. That's just insanely productive for a glass company for back then. And some of those lamp chimneys actually had patents on them. So this is George Klein, another Ravenna citizen who worked at the glass factory, and this is one of his designs for a chimney. And his design is, it goes to the little detail at the top, how it's kind of not a straight top, it's got the wavy, curvy top. That's one of the things that he patented in 1883. These are 6 paper labels from the lamp chimneys that were manufactured here in Ravenna. This is at the collection of the Portage County Historical Society. Now, on the left here, this is a vase, but it's actually pretty obvious that it was made in a lamp chimney mold. So what that glass blower did, he wanted to make kind of a customized thing for himself, and so he took one of those molds and closed up the bottom. Instead of having a open bottom you put over a lamp, he closed up the bottom and made it into a vase. And there's a glass bell that was made in a similar fashion on the right there. These are both at the Portage County Historical Society. This is another thing that was made kind of on a small scale here in town. These are glass paperweights. These were most likely produced by Henry Evans, who was a famous paperweight maker who lived in town here. And these are also at the collection of the Portage County Historical Society. This is, for 4 of these, it's what's known as a lily pattern. You can see it's got kind of like 5 glass leaves going from the center. It's supposed to look like a flower. Here's another paperweight in their collection. This is presented to Winfield Scott Craik, who I looked up. He lived from 1840 to 1913. He was a second lieutenant during the Civil War and became Ravenna's postmaster. So another interesting Ravenna figure. And this is also at the Historical Society. This one is a little less, I would say, refined. It looks kind of like it's scratched in there, but it says, Dr. A. Betts, compliments of Peter Harmon. This is also at the Portage County Historical Society. It's another really pretty decorative item. This was made in Ravenna, and this is a glass powder horn. It has decorative red glass looping, and it was filled with a white powder after cooling. So this was never intended to be a useful product. It was just something that you would keep on a shelf and kind of display. But it was what was known as a whimsy. It was just something that the glass blower would make maybe in his free time. This next slide is from 1888. This is in the Democratic Press. It's saying, it is rumored that on the street that the Crown Flint Glass Works are to be purchased by parties who have an abundance of capital and the ability to run them successfully. We hope the rumors may prove true and this important industry may again be in operation in the near future. But that didn't happen. It ended up being purchased by a trust and then closing. So it was basically the Pittsburgh glass companies that were driving out the competition. They would buy up the buildings and then shut them down. The 1911 Sanborn map shows that this property had transferred to P.L. Frank, who is a lumber contractor, and it was being used as a cement and lumber warehouse. The site was later known as the Fitzgerald Coal Yard, and today no buildings remain in that location. It's just an empty field. And so this is, once again, Highland Avenue and then Pittsburgh Street on the right, which Pittsburgh is It shows up on Google Maps, but you can no longer drive on it. It's just kind of like a closed road. And so that's pretty much why it's hard to tell Ravenna had a glass industry even, because all three of those buildings are no longer there. But even though the buildings no longer remain, there's still lots of memories and stories that go along with that. This is Harriet Taylor Upton. She was born in Ravenna in 1853, and she was a political activist and author. She's best remembered as a leading figure in the struggle for women's rights to vote. And so that's really a hot topic this year because it's the 100th anniversary of that. And this is what she wrote in the History of the Western Reserve. She remembers when she was a child, and she says, "Ravenna children never seemed to go to the glass factory in the winter, but always in the summer. How hot it was. Yet she and her playmates stood around that old furnace watching the men roll the molten glass into balls, blow into the long pipes, and then put the cooling material into molds. They stayed patiently, hoping that the blowers would make a bad bottle, for when they did, it was usually handed out to the children. If so favored, they waited for it to cool and carried it home as one of their treasures. Sometimes if the blower was good-natured, probably having little folks at home, he would blow a little basket or some unusual ornament made of glass in the old factory which stood west of the Pennsylvania tracks on Bowery." So this is that last factory we were looking at where it was just an empty field. Basically the children would go there, and it was entertaining just to watch the glass blowers at work, and they would hopefully make them some little trinket or something to take home with them. I put this slide in here because there's a common misconception that a lot of glass marbles were made in Ravenna. Glass marbles were made in Akron, but actually the marble factory in Ravenna made marbles out of clay. So this was the J.E. Albright Company, and they had a large factory on South Prospect Street making clay marbles. The picture on the left is a patent of the marble making machine, and that's from 1901, and the picture on the right is an advertisement from 1921 showing the marbles, and they're saying, "Sold everywhere, uniform size, round, nicely colored, and well packed." So those were all clay marbles, and it was a big industry in town here, but it wasn't made out of glass, so they were made out of clay. This slide here, this is just going back to the one question I had at the beginning of how important was this industry for Ravenna? And this is from the Inspector of Firms and Factories report of 1887, and they're showing all the major manufacturers in Ravenna at that time. So it's a pretty short list, and it's showing a total of 480 workers. Now, out of those 480 workers, over 55% of them were employed at those two glass companies that were then in business, the Crown Flint and the Diamond Glass Company. So you can see Crown Flint alone, it had 160 male workers, 15 female, and 30 children. They weren't opposed to using children back then. Those are the days before the labor laws. So if you were a kid even, that was the best place to look for work, for the Crown Flint Glass Company. So you can imagine the economic impact that it had on Ravenna and how it really took off after that. Ravenna was really the great place for a glass company, and it turned out to be the industry that led to Ravenna's success in other factories as well. So this concludes my presentation. I'd like to give a special thanks to my brother Brian Gray for his research. He put a lot of work into his knowledge of glass. He's a glass collector, so he really specialized in that for a long time. And I'd also like to thank the Portage County Historical Society for access to their collection. They have a lot of great stuff over there, lots of artifacts. They actually also have some of the tools that the glassmakers would have used when they were blowing the glass. They have a number of the blowpipes and a lot of things that they would have used. So there's a great display up there in their museum to check out. And the last slide I have, this is on the second floor of Reed Memorial Library. So if you want to check out some of those bottles I was talking about, there's actually 9 bottles upstairs that were blown in Ravenna. So it's really a great display upstairs, and it's one thing to see them in a slideshow, but they really look different in person. It's really hard to capture them on film or on video to see what they look like. Glass is really hard to photograph, so if you really want to check them out and see the details, just stop by the library or the Historical Society to check those out. This concludes my lecture, and thank you everybody for watching.
I think we're out.
Awesome. And it really helped me having the clock up there. I usually like having a clock. I can kind of time my speech, so.
With our makeshift studio.
Yeah, I think it worked really well. As long as they could hear me okay, I think.
Sounded like it. I was texting Matt Wonderly and